Good afternoon from Helsinki. We're going to do something different today. It's going to be a fun, spooky, Halloweeny type poem that's also gorgeous. Gorgeous to listen to, gorgeous to read, and it's one that I think a lot of people haven't come across. I did years ago, and then I forgot about it. I actually had, I think it came from a dream, is I had a particular memory that reminded me of this poem. And it's an interesting memory, at least to me. I think I'm going to relate it after I read the poem. But I think this went with, we've been having, this kind of like gloomy weather recently, a lot of light rain, getting into that cold November rain, as the great Axl Rose once said. And it's Halloween. Halloween has become a fairly big holiday among the younger generation in Finland. And it kind of goes with the climate and the, just this time of year, it's getting dusky earlier and earlier and earlier, and you feel it just rapidly. You're getting to these like very, very, very short days. Lots of darkness, lots of gloom, and why not think about the supernatural a little bit. The poet here is Walter de la Mare. Guy lived in UK most of his life. I believe he was born in Kent, and I believe he lived out his days in Twickenham. And he has the French last name. I believe his father was descended from Huguenot. They were silk merchants. Walter de la Mare wrote a lot of stories and poems, a lot of works for children, and he also kind of had that Victorian fascination with the supernatural, the mysteries, psychological horror. He wrote a lot of poems and stories that I guess he would term kind of psychological horror. So he's kind of into the innuendos and inflections. And it's very apparent in this poem, which has quite simple language, and kind of a little bit of a lack of specificity, and that kind of leads to the mystery. And also, when you think about the characters being mentioned, it just kind of like ramps up the horror aspect, or maybe it isn't horror; it's just supernatural and mysterious. But I just felt like it went with the climate, at least that I'm living in. Maybe you're in a warm spot right now. Maybe you're in Cape Town. I don't know. But let's go through this poem. It's called "The Listeners." It was written in 1912. "Is there anybody there?" said the traveler, knocking on the moonlit door. And his horse, in the silence, chomped the grasses of the forest's ferny floor. And a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveler's head, and he smote upon the door again a second time. "Is there anybody there?" he said. But no one descended to the traveler. No head from the leaf-fringed sill leaned over and looked into his gray eyes, where he stood perplexed and still. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men. Stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, hearkening in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveler's call. And he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness answering his cry, while his horse moved, cropping the dark turf neath the starred and leafy sky. For he suddenly smote on the door even louder and lifted his head. "Tell them I came, and no one answered, that I kept my word," he said. Never the least stir made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house from the one man left awake. Aye, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging oogs were gone. Yeah, I love that poem just for the sound of the words. And when I rediscovered it, when I thought of it again this week, I just read through it a few times just to hear the words being spoken, reading to myself. But I love how there's just hints. There's just these shadows, these questions that lead you to wonder, like, who is in the house. Like, maybe you're imagining, a haunted house up on a hill, or a rickety old house in the middle of a wood, or maybe like a beautiful, architecturally perfect little cabin. I don't know. Or maybe you're imagining, what was the name of that painter who made a killing? I think he's dead now, but like he had a huge following, and they even had his like little galleries in shopping malls and things. They called him the Painter of Light. I can't even think of his name anymore, but a friend of mine and I, we used to make fun of him and his just overly done paintings. Maybe it's something like that, and I'm gonna have to look him up. But I like the innuendos, the little inflections. It's like, who is in the house? So like, you imagine these crouching figures or beings, or like, who knows what it could be. It could be interdimensional beings, phantom listeners. It's kind of like, it's subtle, but there is some sense of psychological horror in this poem. And I like the plain language, though it is kind of interesting. The traveler knocks on the door several times, and he first says knocking, but then he changes and he uses the word smote, which is a very interesting word if you look into its etymology, that it kind of had two tracks. Smote could be like smudged out, smoked out. And it could also mean like knocking, rapping, hitting, striking, and it's still, a derivation of that word still lives with us today when you say you're smitten with somebody. But here you don't hear many people say that they smote the door, and he smote upon the door again a second time. Then he mentions smote again instead of knocking. So that's kind of fun, and I like, again, I think I mentioned this before, is like there's a lack of specificity. He's not giving you a real thick description of the place. It's just, it calls upon your imagination. There's enough there, the leaf-fringed sill, his gray eyes, phantom listeners, the quiet of the moonlight, the voice from the world of men, and the moonbeams on the dark stair. And then he just has that simple A, B, C, B, the second and fourth lines rhyme. And it really is a gorgeous poem. But what made me think of it this week, other than the weather and Halloween coming and the psychological terror that is always part of our multiplicity of beings within us, is I was remembering a time. This is back in my major gift days, when I was a very polished person wearing suits every day. And I was in Seattle, and my days were just coffees, lunches, fancy events, cocktail parties, gala events, la-da-dee-da. I was double and triple booked all the time. I knew a lot. People knew that I knew a lot of gossip, and people would take me to lunch just to try to get some gossip from like a segment of society that they weren't clued in on. So it was a fun time. I'm glad I'm not doing it anymore, but I loved it when I was there, and I'm grateful for the connections. I'm still friends with a lot of the people I knew when I was a major gift officer in Seattle. But I was thinking of this one time, and there's really no psychological terror unless there were interdimensional beings in this place I was going to. But yes, I had a friend who was a donor to the organization I worked for, but we also just became friends and traded other information with each other. So we would meet periodically, quarterly, though it wasn't anything like that, and we really became good friends. But this one time, he invites me to have a cocktail, just an ordinary day, catch up, that sort of thing. And it was at this place, fairly new place that had opened up, but near Pike Place Market. And as soon as I made the appointment, and at this time in my life, I was constant, my calendar was full all the time, and I was meeting with all kinds of people. It was so interesting. But I knew as soon as I put that in my calendar that I knew that this appointment was never going to happen. And I don't know how I knew that. It was just something that just came right into my head. This isn't going to happen. But I had no reason to believe that it wasn't. Somebody, we had a lot of mutual respect. We had gotten together many times, never had an issue. Always punctual, blah blah blah, professional. But I knew that this appointment was not going to happen. Although I prepared for it, I was in my calendar. And I think I even canceled something else because I had already committed to this event. Well, not event, but just get together. And so the day arrives, and I go to wherever to meet, and I still in the back of my mind, I have this feeling that this is not going to happen. But I had no messages. Yeah, just went about it as if I was going to meet him there, like we usually did. Though it was a new place. So I get there and I wait for him, and he doesn't show up, and I don't hear from him. And it's like 30 minutes past when we're supposed to meet, and he's always been punctual. It's out of character. I don't hear anything from him. I try to call him, no answer. So it turns out later he had just an absolutely genuine, perfect excuse for not being there and not being able to tell me that he couldn't be there. Wasn't a car accident or anything like that, but it was actually a very, very positive thing. But it did stand me up, I guess, in some sense, even though he had an absolutely stellar excuse for doing so. And he apologized profusely. He left me an extremely long voice message. But I instantly understood, and I knew him well enough at that point that I knew something like that probably had gone on. Like, he wouldn't have done that in a mean-spirited way. But it was but I knew the whole time, maybe we made this appointment 3 weeks in advance, and I knew it was not going to happen. But I didn't know, I had no rational reason to say that, and then in fact it didn't happen. So then he kind of feels bad, although I said, no, it's perfectly fine. If a similar thing happened to me, I would hope that somebody would understand if I had an appointment with them. And so he invites me to lunch on the east side. If you're not familiar with Seattle, east side means like Bellevue. It means Redmond, across Lake Washington, across either the 520 or I think it's the 90 bridge. I used to know these things. I lived in Seattle 10 years. But so we had made this lunch appointment, and it was the end of the year. Of course, it's the busiest time of year usually for development, major gift officers, fundraising operations, or closing last year-end gifts, and making pitches to try and meet goals for the year, things like that. And so like most days, I was on the phone, on the email, meeting with people, just the busiest days of the year. But I had set up this lunch appointment, and then not thinking about that I might have a lot of urgent activity. But I was like, okay, it's fine. So the day arrives. I'm just going to drive from downtown Seattle to Bellevue to meet him for lunch, and get my coat on. I'm about to leave my office, and phone rings. An actual desk phone. Like back in the day, we had these landlines, big clunky desk phone with a cord, and I had no idea who it was going to be on the other line. But that time of year, it's you might only get one shot to actually talk with someone live. Because everybody's busy at that time of year, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to get it. Like, I need to leave, but I'm going to grab this call. And so I grabbed the call. And, of course, it is somebody I've been trying to reach all year, that I've been trying to get an appointment with all year, because major donor, big philanthropist in town. And I had a project that I thought, if I could just sit down with him for 20 minutes, I could convince him to invest in it in a big way. But, so I had sent him emails, I tried to call him, tried to set up an appointment, blah, blah, blah. I ran into him at events, but it never worked out. And I thought he wasn't interested. I thought he was like, we got along quite well on a personal level, but I just thought, well, he's just not interested. But I was like, I just need to get in front of him and explain, this project. It was a little bit of a complicated thing, and I thought he'll get it. He'll get it. I was cocky back then, but so I thought, oh well, maybe he's just ignoring all my emails. I'm wasting all this time and effort, and I think some of my colleagues thought I was just wasting my time trying to cultivate this gift. And so right when I'm trying to leave to meet this person to have this make up lunch for our missed appointment, I'm on the phone, and it's this person I've been trying to reach all year. And he calls me out of the blue, and he had multiple pledges that he was paying on with this organization, and he was in a very good mood on this call, which is kind of odd when I explain a little bit further. But so he's like, okay, I want to catch up on my pledges, and then it turns out that he had been reading my emails, and he just hadn't responded or let me know that he was interested in what I had to propose to him. But he's like, and then he says, I was like, oh, well, maybe I was thinking, well, maybe I can meet him later this week or the next week. No, he says, wait a second. He's like, I have some time now. It's like, can you come to my office like right now? And because he was going to leave and he wasn't going to be in town much the rest of the year. And what I found out later is that he knew that the feds were closing in on him and that he was going to be indicted for, I think, tax evasion. And so there was all this going on, and he wanted to get his gifts in before the end of the year. And so I was in this position where I was like, well, we missed our last appointment. We were supposed to have this great, fun lunch to make up for that. And now this donor that I've wasted so much time this year trying to reach calls me and invites me to his office, like, right now. And so, like, I had one of those conundrums, I guess you'd call it a conundrum. And so I walked over to his office. I sent a quick email to my friend. I was like, I know he'll understand. We're definitely going to make this up in a big way. He's probably already at the restaurant, and I'm not going to be there. And if I left now, I would still be like really late. Anyway, so, but I'm like, oh, he'll understand. Like, he won't think that this is like a, payback for standing me up the previous time, which I had, forgiven him for, of course. So I go to this very, very fancy office, which I actually never been to his office before, this donor that I'd been working on, and have a nice chat with him. I'm just admiring, he's a pretty big art collector, really interesting stuff. I'm really admiring the design of the office as well as the sculpture and art that's there. And so I finally get a chance to propose my idea for him for something else he can invest in, and he's receptive to it. And he decides he wants to just tie everything up. And then, because he's leaving town the next day, and so we're sitting in his office, and then he takes out his checkbook, which is just a regular old, like people used to write checks, like with pens. And you'd have a physical check from your, drawn on a bank, and he just this very, very wealthy man had just the standard like checkbook that everyone has, or if you just default, you don't choose the design or anything fancy for your checks. And so he's like, okay, so if I do this, like, how much is that? And of course, I'd already tallied up what he had due for that year, and then plus this new proposal. And so I just give him a number. It's somewhere into the seven figures. So then he just sits down there and he writes out this check, rips it off, hands it to me, and that's all she wrote. And then a few months later, he's indicted for, I guess, tax evasion, and eventually served some prison time. But anyway, that's another part of the story. But it reminded me of this poem. I hadn't thought about that story in a while, but the main part of it was when I was, stood up for this appointment, and that I knew all along, and for weeks I knew that this appointment was never going to happen. And so it's exactly like The Traveler, at least in my head, in that it's so spooky. It's almost like he's keeping an appointment that he knows is not going to happen. And that's exactly why I connect it with this real life event from 20 years ago in Seattle. And that when I read this poem, and I read through it, I don't know how many times this week, but it's like, that's how I feel. That even though the setting is very different, it's very, very particular. And I love how he's just called The Traveler, capital T. There may be some other associations with that the poet had in mind, but it's like he knows nobody's going to meet him at this house, which I imagine to be like off in the woods, forest's ferny floor. And he's perplexed and still, but only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men. So it's like, it's definitely supernatural. It's definitely treading into some very mysterious territory, but who is this traveler, and why does he show up? Like, why does he feel like he has this obligation to show up to something that could turn out to not be very salubrious, and that seems like a waste of time, because he already knows that no one's going to meet him, but he feels like he has to keep this commitment. And so anyway, I strongly recommend you to check out more from Walter de la Mare, although this may be his most beautiful and interesting poem that he composed. And I'm thinking that, as I continue this series, like maybe I will bring up other poets that have been largely forgotten, but who wrote at least a couple gorgeous, worthy poems. I think the poet and essayist and humorist Randall Jarrell said that a poet is someone who stands out in a thunderstorm consistently and gets struck by lightning like 5 or 6 times in their life, and that's the great poets. But anyway, I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and enjoy the changing of the season if you're in a climate that affords you that opportunity. Thanks again, and be well.